to the second meeting of the GrowthNet, Reviving Growth, Reversing Tides. We started this morning with 2 workshops, one on water and one on trade facilitation, in partnership with WWF India and ICRIER. Very robust discussion. This is just an indication of what we have in store for you for the next 3 days. And with over 100 speakers from 25 countries, including 12 institutional partners from Asia, Latin America, North America, and the Middle East, we hope to bring you the diversity that we want to have in the room to have a discussion on the topic of the growing economies. This is an interesting time in India. Elections are the buzzword. There is really not much happening in the newspapers, as you can see, other than coverage of India's elections. It is possibly the largest exercise anywhere in the world of this kind, with over nearly 800 million voters, of which 120 million are first-time voters. So it's quite an experience, and I'm glad that so many of you from other countries are here to get a buzz of this new India. I would like to warmly welcome our co-chairs for this meeting, Mr. Stan Bergman, Ms. Janan Chelebologlu, Mr. Ronnie Chan, Ms. Wendy Luhabe, and Mr. Ramadurai. Thank you very much for doing us the honors of being here. We are also delighted to have institutional partners from Bangladesh, Israel, South Korea, Malaysia, Mexico, Sri Lanka, Singapore, and the United States. One of our main programs at Ananta are the Track 2 dialogues, the bilateral we run with different countries. And we are very pleased that our partners from Turkey, from Israel, from USA, Singapore are all here today. Thank you. This meeting would not have been possible without the generous support of our sponsors, Tata Consultancy Services, Ken India, Godrej & Boyce, RKBK Fiscal Services, Avanta, RPG Group, Covington. Our sincere appreciation also to the media for being here on a Sunday afternoon. Thank you very much. Last but not the least, my sincere and special thanks and appreciation to our partners for this meeting, Claude, Smadja, and Yale Smadja, a dynamic father and daughter duo. With this, may I request Yale to please give her own words of welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Kiran. First of all, I would also like to thank you all for being here for this second edition of the GrowthNet. I also want to say how happy and honored we are at Smadja and Smadja to be working with Ananta Center on this ambitious project to create the foremost platform for new growth countries. On a personal note, I am thrilled to work with Mr. Tarun Das and Kiran Pasricha as I started my career as an intern on a conference in this very special building in 1995. And they are partly responsible for me wanting to be in this business. So thanks for that. We have developed a program this year around the mission of the GrowthNet, which, as you know, is one, to further boost the business, trade, and financial linkages among the new constellation of growth countries, helping to identify new business opportunities and creating new relationships. 2, to provide an open platform to address the common challenges facing this group of countries. And 3, to help crystallize the common expectations and ambitions for a greater role for these countries in the functioning of the global economy. We know this is a process, and we're already looking at the next steps, thinking about next year. We have been honored to be invited by business communities in 3 cities in China, as well as here in New Delhi, to hold the next growth meeting in March of 2015. We will make our decision in the next few weeks as to where the meeting will be located, and of course we will announce it. But I'm skipping ahead. So without further ado, I would like to call Mr. Rakesh Mohan and Claude Smadja to the stage. And I need to give you a hint about what's going to happen afterwards. We're going to make you work together. So it's better if you regroup tables and you're quite a few at one table, because we're going to do a brainstorming. Claude, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to see so many friendly, familiar faces. It is also a pleasure to see so many of you who were with us last year. So we are beginning to look like a club. As Yael mentioned, there is nothing free in the world, so you are going to work this afternoon. The idea is that we will have a kind of introduction, then we will love to have you regroup around tables. The tables will be discussing among two questions that we will raise, and most importantly, we want to hear your input and your feedback, because this will, in a way, feed the discussions over the next 2 days. But first of all, let me start with some points. Because, you know, in the last few months, we have heard so many things about emerging markets going down the drain. We have heard so many things that all of a sudden we went from hyper-hype to gloom and doom. And we heard that, in a way, the era of the high growth in emerging market was over, that the year 2013, when growth in emerging market was driving the global economy, was just an aberration, and we were back to normal in 2014, and so on and so forth. So let us try to clear the landscape. Let me start with some basic reality. Reality number one, there is no emerging markets crisis. It is a slowdown, but despite what some lazy analysts would say, there is no risk of a rerun of the Asian crisis 97-98. Quite simply because the conditions are completely, radically different. Emerging markets today have much stronger economies. They have quite stronger foreign exchange reserves. They have relatively low debt, and most of the debt is in domestic currency. All this rubbish about the risk of a rerun of the Asia crisis is just what it is, plain rubbish. And in fact, what has been said about the risk in China, about the problems created by the shadow banking, of course, it is a very serious problem. It is a very serious problem, but we know at the same time that the government of China is already tackling it. We know already that there are a number of reforms underway, and we know that China has not only the resources to deal with this problem, but the good thing about China is that when they decide to do something, they just do it. They don't procrastinate with it. So this is reality number one. Reality number two, even if there is a slowdown in emerging market countries, as long as we can see ahead, growth in emerging markets will be way, way, way higher than in developed countries. And this for very simple, basic reasons. It will be higher because of structural trends. Urbanization, that we know is a very strong engine for economic growth. Demographic dividend in most of the countries except China and Brazil. The fledgling middle class with higher and higher expectation and money to meet at least some of these expectations. And last but not least, the action, the role, the dynamism of the new MNCs from emerging market countries, the new champions redefining the rules of competition in the global economy. So this is reality number 2. Reality number 3, very important, and it is a very good thing. It is the end of the era where there was this kind of monolithic approach to emerging market or new growth countries. The era where you had almost a knee-jerk reaction when you say emerging market and you open the tap for investment. This is the era of differentiation among emerging market. Of course, emerging market will remain a very solid core of investment decision, especially among private equity firms. But as I said, differentiation will be the key word. What does that mean? It means that when going into emerging market with your eyes wide open, you look at the combination of macro and microeconomic factor. You look much more closely at corporate and political governance risk. And above all, you need to see how, depending on the policies which are pursued, countries will be able to mitigate the negative impact of presumably higher interest rates in the future by leveraging the growth that has resumed in the United States, a China that will be hovering between 7 and 8% growth, and commodity prices, which, not going at the record levels that we had before, will be at reasonably higher stage. So in a way, differentiation will be absolutely crucial, and this differentiation will be made by policies, as especially smart industrial policies from countries, and this differentiation will be made by smart corporate policies in the countries involved. Reality number 4, thanks God, it is the end of the gimmick of the brick. As you know, the brick was more a tremendously successful PR gimmick of Goldman Sachs than having any sense of economic reality. And we have to admit, they were a genius in PR and marketing. This gimmick lasted for 10 years. And we know today that it is a gimmick because there is nothing in common between India, China, Brazil, and Russia. But what counts, and this is important, because this gimmick distorted perception. It was very dangerous, in fact, and it masked a profound reality. The profound reality is that the sustainability of growth relies not on 4, 5, 6 countries, but it relies on a whole new constellation of growth, comprising 10, 12, 15 countries, because it is in evolving shape. And this group of countries are the ones which are driving growth because, among other things, of growing interaction among them. So when you look at these basic realities, when you look at the slowdown, when you admit that some of the tailwinds which boosted high growth in the last 10 years, and these tailwinds are diminishing or fading, what does that mean? What does it require us to do? And the answer, my answer, and you can add whatever points you want. My answer is on 7 points. Point number 1, the new growth countries will have to rely less on exports because despite the recovery in the US, despite the so-called recovery in Europe, because there is no recovery in Europe, exports will remain stagnant. And so the key issue for emerging countries is to boost domestic demand. And we know that in every single country in the new growth constellation, there is tremendous domestic demand which has yet to be tapped. If I want to take one example, and I will take it here in India, look at the success of a Godrej group in tapping the resources of consumer in Africa, as an instance. Another example, look at the study of a very famous Indian consultant about the wealth at the bottom of the pyramid. And what needs to be done is to create the policies, the credit structures that will help to leverage more this tremendous potential for domestic consumption. Action number 2. We know that financial markets will be tighter. So what does that mean? It means quite simply that instead of looking almost only on foreign resources, financial resources, emerging countries need today to accelerate the deepening and the expansion of their own financial markets. And there is a lot to be done because when you just look at one factor, the rise of healthcare and pension schemes that these countries are beginning to have, and we know that, for instance, pension schemes can be a tremendous addition in terms of boosting, expanding financial markets. Just look at what China is today doing in terms of reform of their financial markets, in terms of making them more efficient, in terms of making them deeper, in terms of allowing more foreign investors to come into them. This is very, very serious, and this is very, very important. So in a way, what will be a task now is not only, as I said, to deepen and expand, but also to create the mechanism for greater mobilization and better allocation of existing domestic resources. Task number 3, structural reforms. Of course, I sound like a broken record, but structural reforms are essential. And they are essential because business needs to become even more free from the constraints, from the regulatory rigidities, which keep hampering its dynamism. And these reforms have to happen rather fast. These reforms will make the difference when we get back to this notion of differentiation among the different emerging markets. I know, for instance, that Mexico today, the Mexican economy, is growing by far too slowly according to its potential. There is a disappointment about the economic performance of Mexico. But when you look at the reforms which are being undertaken, these reforms, for instance, will make the difference tomorrow between a Brazil, which is not doing what they should be doing at the moment, and Mexico, which is doing some very interesting reforms. I spoke about financial reforms in China and the intention of the leadership to accelerate a number of reforms, especially giving greater weight to the private sector. These reforms, if India continue, despite all logic, to remain sitting on its hand, then this reform will continue to make a big difference between China and India. And nobody in this room wants to see that. Point number 4. Reform is good, but implementation is better. And what we have seen in the past is maybe sometimes well-intentioned reforms and very bad implementation, sometimes creating an adverse impact on what was supposed to be a positive decision. Let us face it. Bureaucrats, most of them, many of them, are very bad at implementation. And many politicians who get into minister's office don't know a thing about efficient implementation, except maybe in Singapore and maybe 2 or 3 other countries. And it is time, when discussing implementation, that governments think about bringing the people who know about implementation, business leaders who know about time efficiency, business leaders who know how to connect the dots. It is time that government realize that public-private partnership is not just a thing that you discuss when you are discussing financing of infrastructure project or management of infrastructure project. This notion of private-public partnership has to become an all-encompassing concept in many aspects, driving economic policy in every country concerned. And let me tell you something. Any political leader who will ignore this concept is not only doomed to failure, but even more importantly, is doomed to have his name or her name associated with the failure of its country. Point number 5. Reform is good, implementation is good, but reform is not a magic mantra. Reform has to be focused. And today, in the present context, the focus of reform has to be on what will increase efficiency in the public and private sector, what will increase productivity and profitability in the public and private sector. What does that mean? It means that when you need to create a priority ranking in terms of reform, what needs to come first is reform creating better infrastructure, mitigating the infrastructure bottleneck, which are a killer for economic growth. It means reform that will allow the integration of women in the economic life. The scandal of underemployment of women's potential in economic life, in creativity, is really a scandal which has to be stopped by all political will. It means creating the conditions for integrating and for leveraging technological advancement in a much faster, efficient way, and so on. So this is what we mean by efficient reform. Point number 6. We have spoken about export being, let's say, stagnant toward developed countries. But the good news, the tremendously good news, is the fact that South-South trade is exploding. In the last 10 years, the share of South-South trade in global trade has gone from about 17% to more than 30% today. South-South trade today represents $5 trillion. $5 trillion. And of course, it is expanding. So you might say this is good, but this is not enough. And one thing why it is not enough, look at the lessons from the 2008 crisis. Exports from south to south recovered faster, better, stronger than exports from north to north or exports from north to south, which shows the potential that can be exploited, the resilience, the strength of South-South trade. Today, and we had a workshop this morning, the question, for instance, is how to take advantage of the Bali Agreement on Trade Facilitation. Just look at one figure. There is no tariff on 80% of trade among developed countries. But trade among emerging markets, less than 60% is zero tariff. So it shows the kind of work that needs to be done. And the big question, how do emerging markets do with the new big trade deals which are in the offing, like the trade deal between Europe and the United States? In that respect, look at how ASEAN is developing. Look at the Mexican initiative to create the Pacific Alliance with a number of Latin American emerging countries. So this notion of stronger trade policies, South-South trade policies, is absolutely essential. And point number 7, my last point, trade, South-South trade is good, but it is not enough. What we need to do in the coming years is tremendously increase the connectiveness and the connectivity among emerging market countries, the new growth countries. You know that today, social media traffic in India, in China, is much higher than in the United States. Social media traffic in Mexico, in Brazil, in Indonesia is higher than in any European country, and just behind US traffic. So imagine the potential that digital connectivity has in terms of bringing these countries together, bringing entrepreneurs together, sharing knowledge, leapfrogging in terms of technology. But as good as digital connectivity is, it is not enough. We need much more face-to-face connectivity. Just as an example, one blatant example, the huge gap of knowledge and understanding between China and India. It is incredible that we have this huge gap of knowledge and understanding. Of course, there are political issues, but what we have at the basis is a tremendous gap of knowledge and understanding. And we need to look at another stupid thing. It is easier to go from Delhi to New York than to go from Delhi to Beijing and vice versa. So how do you want to have greater connection and connectivity if airlines are not, in a way, connecting you, if you don't have the networks that will help connect you? So these are the kind of things that need to be part of this action plan. So these are the 7 points I wanted, in a way, to share with you. And, of course, as I said before, there is a slowdown. So what? According to the World Bank, today, emerging countries have 30% of the global stock of capital. According to the World Bank, and it was a study made 2 years ago, by 2030, which is in 15 years, emerging market will have not anymore 30%, but 50% of the global stock of capital. Okay, because of a slowdown, maybe we will not get there by 2030. It will be 2034 or 2035. So what? Nobody ever expected that the upward trajectory of the new growth countries will be a straight, linear line. But after all, are not business leaders supposed to be good at managing the bumps in the road? Are not they supposed to be good in expanding their anticipation capabilities? Are not they supposed to be good in terms of making sure that short-term consideration don't obscure long-term strategic options? Are not they to be good to be the one who create and sustain the confidence? They are supposed to be good in all these qualities. So once again, it is time to prove it. Thank you very much. Now, before you go to work, I would like to ask my friend Rakesh Mohan to, in a way, bring his own comments, and he will get back to us later once you have worked. Rakesh.
Thank you very much, Claude. I think I'm speaking in India after a long time, actually. So thank you very much for inviting me, Tarun, Claude, for the GrowthNet. Unfortunately, I don't have much to disagree with Claude, which is very boring, actually. I wish I had more to disagree with him, which would have made life much more interesting. So I'm just putting a few footnotes to what you've said. First, just to reinforce what you said on the potential of emerging markets, that just to put some numbers on it, the last 5 years or thereabouts, since the what I always call the North Atlantic financial crisis broke. People call it the global financial crisis. You know, when there was an Asian financial crisis, they didn't say it was a global financial crisis, they said it was Asian financial crisis. When the financial crisis is in Europe and US, they call it global. So I've always said this is the NAFC, not the GFC, North Atlantic financial crisis, which of course has had global economic impacts, as did the Asian financial crisis. But that is by the way. Since the North Atlantic financial crisis broke in 2008-9, the average growth in the advanced economies has been around 1.3, 1.4%, if that, whereas the average growth in the developing Asia has been about 6.5%. So there has been, despite the slowdown and everything that is talked about in the media, in fact, developing Asia, even in the last 5 years, has recorded something like 6.5%. And even if you take all the emerging market and developing economies put together, even that has been around 5% in the last 5 years. And as of the January projections of the IMF, World Economic Outlook, they expect it to be over 5% in the next 5 years. That is the emerging markets and developing economies put together, whereas developing Asia, of course, is even higher. So that's the first, just to reinforce, Claude, what you said, that a lot of this gloom and doom that has been put about regarding emerging markets is just not true. However, we do need to understand that there will be more instability in global financial markets in the next few years. The US monetary policy taper, or the unwinding of the unconventional monetary policy, has indeed begun, and as announced by the new Fed chair, Janet Yellen, it will continue over the next year and a half, and the likelihood of the policy rate of the United States going up is now very high by mid-2015, if not earlier. And the point of that is that that is just the beginning, in the sense that it's the other advanced economies also, that is the Bank of England, which has also done a huge expansion of monetary policy in the last 5 years. They have not yet begun their taper. Similarly, the Bank of Japan, that will of course happen much later, but at some point they will also have to start contracting in terms of monetary policy. And also, of course, Europe, the European Central Bank. So one of the things that we do need to understand from an emerging market point of view is that there will not be the kind of cheap capital that has been available in the last 5 years. And in a sense, there's nothing wrong with that. We did well even before capital was as cheap as it has been, but we do need to guard ourselves, both from the macro policy managers, both fiscal managers as well as monetary managers, to understand that this is bound to happen, but also from the corporate point of view. One of the things that has happened in the last 5 years in Asia is that the corporate sector is indeed, as a whole in Asia, of course there are country variations, the corporate sector as a whole in Asia is more leveraged than it was 5 years ago. Nonetheless, it is still less leveraged than historic averages. But it is more leveraged than it was 5 years ago. And what it does mean is that both from the macro manager's point of view, from investors' point of view, that there are indeed some weak corporate entities in Asia which will need to be watched carefully, because they will have difficulty in the coming years, but not the corporate sector as a whole, which again goes back to one thing that Claude said, that one of the differences in the next 5 years would be that you have to differentiate much more, not just among countries, but also among corporate entities, and including in this country. So the basic point I'm trying to make there is that, yes, the growth of emerging markets will be much higher than advanced economies for quite some time to come. Their markets will continue growing, their growth will be higher, domestic demand as well as exports. But there are going to be some difficulties from the financial side, which will then translate into some real economy corporate sector entities. And a footnote to that is that the kind of fragility that was observed middle of last year, when there was the first announcement or the first indication by Ben Bernanke on the beginning of tapering of the US monetary policy, that there was indeed a good deal of fragility that was observed in some emerging markets, including that of India. One of the things that has happened since then is, two things have happened. One, that it is felt that the communication of the US Federal Reserve has improved since then. Second, that the emerging markets that were affected, including India, have indeed recovered, have improved their policies for managing their macro situation, so that things are somewhat calmer now than they were between May and August last year. However, the point I wanted to make is that the kind of the kind of problems that took place in middle of last year, we should not be surprised if they happen again, because despite the best intentions of the central banks in the advanced economies, you never know how markets react. Also, that if you have perhaps more good news in the United States, this is a mixed thing, that if you have more good news in the United States, that is, the recovery is faster than is currently expected, the responsive monetary policy in terms of contraction, in terms of tightening, will also be faster, which might come as a surprise to markets than today. So it's a mixture of good news. Good news in the sense that, of course, the whole world benefits if the US economy recovers faster. But on the other hand, there could be some problems in financial markets. And therefore, there's a lesson both for macro managers, that is central banks in emerging markets, finance ministries, but also for corporate managers, that you need to be prepared for this kind of fragility to rear its head again and again in the next few years, because it is going to be a period of recovery and there will be some problems. We've already seen some new geopolitical problems arising in the last couple of weeks with Ukraine and Russia. Somehow, fortunately, the markets have not reacted very much to what is going on, but again, you never know. You also don't know what might happen to energy prices as a consequence of further sanctions on Russia, etc. So, so these are the 2 or 3 cautions I wanted to put forward while agreeing with what Claude said in general. And the final point I want to make is that when he talked about structural reform, implementation, etc., I would put what he said somewhat differently in terms of what needs to be done. That apart from doing more public-private partnerships, there needs to be better realization in emerging market countries and developing countries that you have to make governments themselves much more competent. That the degree of expertise in government establishments needs to be much more improved. And this is something that has been completely neglected, certainly in this country, the last 25 years, We did a great deal of reform on a continuous basis starting in the early 1990s, but almost no change in how the government functions. For example, the US Department of Transportation has something like 60,000 people. 60,000. Am I right, Alisa? It's something of that order. And if you include the various state transportation, I'm talking about transportation because I should put a plug for myself here. I'm talking about transportation because I just submitted a report on National Transport Development Policy. So we reviewed some of these things in that context. So I won't go into detail. The point I only want to make is that good government involves making people in government more competent, more professionalism, more training, understanding that there are lots of activities that the government does that are technical in nature, which you cannot do unless you bring in more technical competence. So I would add that to your list of real program for bringing in more technical competence in government. So I thought I'll just make these few points and then have the discussion in the room, and then we can come back. Thank you very much.
Okay, now is your turn, and I still see some people who are very shy and who want to isolate themselves in some corners, like in the classroom, so that they think they can escape the duty to work. I see some of my friends' faces there who are trying to hide. So come on, join tables so that we regroup tables together. I will ask each table, first of all, to identify, and here you don't need to be democratic. Act Singapore way. You elect a volunteer, or you design a volunteer who will be the rapporteur at your table. And then I will ask the tables to discuss over the next 30 minutes 2 questions. First question, when you look at your own business or when you look at your national economy, what are the key issues or challenges that today worry you most? I know that all of you have very good sleep, but if you were to have some insomnia, what would be creating it when you think at your business or at the economic situation of your country? Question number 2, it is, what are the 1 or 2 priority actions that you would like to see happening over the next 6 months, in terms of, as we said before, this is the theme of this second annual meeting, reviving growth, reversing the tides. So please make the tables complete. Those who are only 2 or 3 at one table, join tables so that we have compact tables. We don't want to force you at gunpoint, but do that voluntarily. And now you have about 30 minutes to discuss among yourselves these 2 questions. But as I said before, I think it will be good that if you introduce yourselves at the table and you appoint a volunteer who will report on your discussion. So good work, and we are back in 30 minutes. Now start to hear what you have to say. So who would want to take the first shot? Who will be the first rapporteur from the table? Here we are. Let us start. Can we get a microphone here? Sir? So you have been nominated as a volunteer.
Push me into it.
Yes, this is democracy.
This democracy at work. Okay, the theme of the growth net this year is reviving growth and reversing the tide. You heard both Mr. Smadja and Dr. Rakesh Mohan. Fundamentally, we agree with the submissions which you made. And then the two questions you wanted us to address were, when you look at your business or the national economy, key issues or challenges which worry you the most. And we came to the following conclusions, being a democratic representation of US, Nigeria and India on the table. We thought clearly leadership, polarization of politics, inequality, shrinking middle class, and unemployment, followed by lack of implementation and ease of doing business, were some of the things which were the issues that need to be addressed. Second part of the question which you said was one or two priority actions you would like to see happening in the next 6 months, not in terms of outcomes, but in terms of actions which can lead to actions or outcomes much later. Skilling, education and vocational education as part of the whole education for implementation. Continue things like unemployment benefits in the US for the 6 months, but then implementation and investments in the infrastructure projects, etc. And of course, implementation of the existing programs which may be underway. I think these are some of the actions which we can put in place. Transparency, ease of investments, skilling of the workforce so that the supply and demand mismatches are understood and create more jobs. Those were some of the things which we wanted to recommend.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Next table. Here we go. I will come to here. Here we go. Can we get the mic here, please? And then you.
Thank you very much. I think with having 3 people who are looking at the risk session tomorrow around the table, we decided to not rehearse our presentations and conversations tomorrow. But I think the 3 main worries that came up from our conversation was one, was the lack of predictability and certainty about regulatory environment and policy. Second, to follow up on what Mr. Ramadura was saying, the impact of not focusing on talent, jobs, skills, vocational training. And that wasn't just a point that was relevant in India, it was relevant in most of the countries that are represented in this room that we're talking about, especially where you have a large part of the population under the age of 25. The third and possibly most troubling area that kept most of us awake at night was the things that go bump in the dark geopolitically, and the inability of business or government to read the signs in the right way and to join things up. I think in terms of where we'd like to see action in the next 6 months, changing the discourse, starting to focus on quality of growth issues rather than just the absolute top line level of growth and numeric identifications of growth. And the second was a question really is, have we got the lens right when we talk about growth being rooted in GDP? Should we be starting to look at other issues? And that very much came into the quality of growth side of things.
Thank you very much. Then we go to this table. You will get the mic 1 second.
Thank you, Claude. My name is Nalin Kohli. We had on our table 3 industry verticals represented. And coming to your first point on own business challenges, we examined that. The three verticals were IT, defense, and infrastructure. In IT, this whole issue, IT is one of India's strengths. We are known all over the world now because of our performance. But if you look at India's IT's exports, about 70% is to the US, 20% is to Europe, and 10% to the rest of the world. And we are very, very keen on this South-South cooperation. I think we have just about scratched the surface. We have never gotten to know what exactly the developing countries want in terms of IT, because our IT industry is very US-centric. And we think this should be facilitated some way. And there is a huge potential there. There was also a feeling that the human resources that we get as we move up the value chain, what Mr. Ramadurai also mentioned, that we need more skilling and better quality of people. There was also a sense that IT services are happening, but India has the capability to do a lot of non-IT services, particularly in education, in health, which needs to be looked at. The second vertical was defense. India last year became at the distinction of being the largest importer of defense equipment. And we find there is a big disconnect between our own Indian industry and our defense procurement. The intent is there, but the rules, procedures, and policies that are being followed, they do not facilitate that. And this can be a huge driver of growth in the Indian economy. We have the industries there. In fact, I met a defense minister of one of the European countries, and I said, how come you are into defense industry? And he said, we have good IT, we have good metallurgy, we thought we'll be good in defense. So India has IT, India has a very good auto industry, and we should be doing good in defense. So infrastructure, the feeling was that you mentioned about public-private partnership. We feel there is a need for a partnership between our central government and our state government. So the industry partner and the government partner are there, but we have issues where the state government and the central government are not on the same page. Yes. And many infrastructure projects don't happen because of that. So our PPP has to be redefined as in the public side there are two participants, the government of India and the concerned state government or governments. So on the priority actions, this whole issue, and Dr. Rakesh Mohan is here, World Bank itself has got a report where India is 134th or something on ease of doing business. I think this should be a priority issue in the country. How do we make the ease of doing business happen? Why can't we target to be amongst the top 20 in the next few years? Unless we really go after this, lot of our potential will not be unleashed.
I agree.
And we talk of corruption, and corruption is in direct proportion. If you don't have ease of doing business, what do you do? I mean, you don't like it, but that's the way many people then operate. We also had the benefit of academia representative on our table, and he has said that change management, as we grow, and particularly in the government sector, people have to relook at how they do things. This whole issue of psychological issues of change management need to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let us go first here, and then we will move to you.
Okay. Our table had Israeli, American, and Indian interests in overlapping people, so there was not a strict representation. Very seasoned business people, so they pushed me to be the speaker, and I yielded. We started from the short term, and actually there was a joint venture already structured, and then we moved on to the more broader concerns, and we identified three. One was the sort of concern, or the issue was to reimagine a connected world geopolitically and culturally. That was issue number one. Second one was to sort of, in light of the dynamics of emerging, submerging economies, to be able to find some guidelines with respect to what next and where next. And finally, there was a discussion of the role of government in enabling business rather than preventing it. And that's where we closed then the discussion.
Can you just elaborate one sentence what you meant by submerging and emerging?
There was a notion that the dynamics requires, sort of echoing a theme that you have brought up, that it's not about identifying a country possibly or a group of countries and focusing on the one acronym or another, but what I would call a selective strategy, selective business strategy, perhaps within, let's say, China and India and other countries, being more fine-tuned and finding opportunities, articulate business opportunities in a much finer way than, blocks as we used to do it in the past.
Thank you. So we go to you, sir.
Thank you. We had a team from China, consisting of people from China, Switzerland, and India. Interestingly, we divided our focus into certain systemic issues which keeps us awake, and some issues are more macro. I pick up the macro issues which affects us: lack of policy direction, policy implementation, and often that leads to policy instability, which is obviously from the government side as well as at the state level. Going into the second issue, which affects us quite often, is the rule of law, implementation of rule of law, and in certain cases, delayed justice, delayed implementation of the rule of law. These two are more broad issues, I would say, and then going into certain infrastructural saturated countries or industrialized countries like EU, we see over-regulation. And when we see over-regulation, we cannot consider that in isolation because the impact is global. Going into more macro issues, we feel that there is a problem with obviously with the economy US and the EU economy slowing down. There is a problem of lack of globalization of global governance, lack of strengthening of the WTO. We see that quite often the barriers to trade are increasing. Apparently, it seems that the tariff barriers are decreasing, but the non-tariff barriers are increasing, so the ease of doing trade is not there, or we are facing problem on the macro issue. Coming into a couple of systemic issues that we see is, you touched upon it while you spoke, is social benchmarking. There is a tendency to do social benchmarking without considering reality, and then what happens is, since there is lack of pragmatic approach to it, the pursuits becomes irrational. And when I say you might have touched upon it, we refer to the discussion on BRIC, and that's what we bring in reference point. And finally, we see, which is affecting both industrialized and non-industrialized countries, is the problem of water shortages. Water tables are falling irrespective of geographies, and apart from in some countries, we see problems of even it can escalate to war. Even the private sector is affected because there are energy production is being affected. So in a nutshell, we have these from the table.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Next, Clyde.
So we had a group consisting of US, Indian, and Australian members. And interestingly, it seems that we all have the same problems. We were all concerned about unemployment and investment inequality, and let me dissect those a little bit more. In the US, we have falling unemployment, which sounds like a good thing, but at the same time, we also have falling employment, which means, in effect, that people are falling out of the workforce. Australia is suffering from the problem that the mining and minerals sector of the economy is dominating the economy to such an extent that the other sectors are losing ground and disappearing, and thereby again causing unemployment. And in India, it seems that employment in organized industries has not increased significantly, despite fairly substantial growth in India over the past 5 to 10 years. So what are the factors behind this? And again, there was a great deal of similarity. A paucity of investment, which our table felt is driven by a lack of certainty, not so much by regulation per se, by the fact that it's difficult to anticipate what the regulations will be. And so because of uncertainty about the regulatory environment, hesitation to invest. Secondly, a lack of trained, experienced, educated workforce, and the concern about where will education be going, how will training be done, and will it be appropriate to the technological developments taking place. Indeed, will there, in view of the technological developments, will technology wind up replacing many of the jobs? And then great concern about environmental factors, pollution, inhibiting infrastructure development, pollution, destroying quality of life, and inhibiting investment. And then finally, the water issue and lack of water undermining economic growth very broadly. Then final point of concern was one that was mentioned earlier, which is the unpredictable but probably inevitable surprises that could take place geopolitically. The Russian-US conflict over Crimea recently being one example, but also tensions between China and Japan and so forth as unforeseeable, but probably inevitably having substantial impacts on growth.
Thank you, Clyde. Carlos? Oh, sorry, no? Yes, go ahead.
Is it on? Yeah. Carlos Braga, IMD. Well, I have mixed feelings in adding my contribution on behalf of this table now. My definition of mixed feelings is when you see your mother-in-law go over a cliff in your brand new BMW. So basically we heard everything that people have already mentioned was to a certain extent discussed in this table. We had a group encompassing representatives from Thailand, Brazil, India, and Sri Lanka. But there were also some big differences. Let me start with the common aspects in the discussion. The common aspects were systemic issues like governance, quality of governance, problems with corruption, concerns about the development models. But here there were some big differences. For instance, there was some discussion about, in the case of Brazil, actually the rebalancing has to be exactly the opposite of what was discussed during your intervention. Actually, Brazil has been relying on a consumer-based growth, and this is not sustainable. But in all countries at the table, there was concern about growing indebtedness and macroeconomic imbalances, inflation in the case of India, Brazil. More specifically, there were issues about the structural change that are needed with respect to education. For instance, the productivity in these economies has been relatively low, below potential, and there was consensus that much more needs to be done and investment in education should be a priority. At the same time, this is going to take time, and issues like youth unemployment were also discussed, so it's not a problem in Brazil, but on the other hand, although inequality in Brazil is declining in contrast to most of the other countries in the world, you still have very high levels of inequality and violence at very high levels. So these are issues that were discussed. Finally, the question of productivity was also related to the question of infrastructure bottlenecks. And many of these countries are investing much below what would be optimal in terms of their physical infrastructures to really benefit from the process of globalization. So all in all, these were some of the topics that were discussed. We didn't have time to say exactly what to do the next 6 months, but there were some suggestions that with respect to governance, we need to focus much more on mechanisms for accountability of government. So the experience of India with ombudspersons was discussed, but in the end there was a consensus that the vision is great, but vision without implementation is hallucination.
Thank you very much. Ralph, we are going to you.
So the things that are the key issues or challenges that are worrying us the most were 2 points. One, the pervasiveness of corruption and the ability of legacy or established companies to use it as a tool to crush competition. And the second was the presence in political systems where extreme views are present and frustrating the ability to compromise and to govern. And the actions that we'd like to see over the next 6 months, one is a majority government, and the second is the more concerted enforcement of robust competition laws in order to minimize the impact on the economy of large global companies. And again, the emphasis is on creating opportunities for new companies, new businesses to compete and establish themselves.
When you spoke about majority government, you were thinking about India?
Correct.
Thank you.
Without expressing a view.
Okay.
Hello.
This table?
You see, hello.
Listening to you.
I'm Dr. A.K. Rajput. I'm from agriculture sector of India, and luckily we all are from India on our table. So we have talked about agriculture things, and especially for poultry. You asked that what are challenging we are facing in our business. You see, in poultry, the basic challenge is which we are facing in India. Not only India, world over, it is the bird flu. Because of bird flu, this business is getting affected. And let me tell you, India is an agriculture country, and our GDP contribution of agriculture is 4%. And in agriculture, poultry has got 20% contribution. So it's a very, very important part of the agriculture growth. And second is, in like other agriculture commodities, in poultry, the end price is also not as per the production cost. It depends upon the middleman. So what are the 1 or 2 priorities factor which we can see in next 6 months to revive this industry? We feel that there should be a publicity by the government about the bird flu. It's almost a scare. It is not an actual thing which is happening. Let me give you an example. As per the OIE norms, WTO, if bird flu comes in a country, that country cannot export its poultry products to other countries. But if in India it's such a large country, in one corner, if there's a small outbreak of bird flu, whole India becomes blacklist. But if you talk about European, all countries, they are at the distance of 200 kilometers, 400 kilometers. But if in Denmark is positive for bird flu, nothing will happen to West Germany, nothing will happen to France. So that is something which is, we feel it's a double standard or not clarity about regulations. So it hampers the growth of this sector. Secondly, we feel in India we have a very limited processing industry in this issue, in this. So we need a more processing in this. So which government should encourage. We have very less processing plants in India, 5 or 6, whereas we are the 4th largest producer of the chicken in the world. We should have more than 50 plants immediately. So government should encourage. So by the various regulations of the government, we are deeply burdened. There is no regularity, there is no clarity in the regulations. There is a heavy interest, and technical skill is also very less in this industry. There is a very, very low technical development, and government standards are also very less. They should make good standards. So like this, we want to finish our...
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Table, here.
Is it?
Yes, we hear you.
We on this table are represented by South Africa, India, and India. So we had a good look into what South-South actually would mean and what challenges, what we're looking up to. I think your first question was challenges that we think our business and economy could really take on. And we thought that despite all the growth that we've had, all the development we've had, the South, not just India, is actually far from being an industrialized country or region. I think if World War I and World War II, the Second World War was won because of industrialization of the West, the one fundamental change. And I think that drove those countries, gave them a head start, and brought them to where it was. So I think this is one big difference, not just industries. I mean, we have a lot of good industries, but is it actually a process that can be counted as industrialization, that's regional leadership, that can take on global leadership, not just for its own development and benefit, but particularly in the South Asian region, and then it can be extended. So we have excellent business, but is this actually the industrialization in the true sense? The second point was, what are those 1 or 2 priority actions we'd like to have insomnia about? And I think the first one was South-South trade. Your figures of 5 trillion trade, South-South, was really inspiring. And I think if in all this dungeon of rules and regulations and competitive markets, we can achieve 5 trillion, it is by better regulation and governance, this can actually be doubled, if not tripled. The system needs to change. The system needs to promote and make more of collaborative business than competitive business. And I think we need to open up, the entire system needs to open up, and the one fundamental requirement will be good governance. It's been mentioned by a lot of speakers, but good governance would imply good decision making, transparency, and I think for India and the South Asian region, one thing that we're looking forward is getting off from these hung parliaments and coalition politics. Thank you.
Thank you. Back to your point about industrial strengths, I think it is a very crucial point, and it is blatant in the case of India, because India has a scandalously narrow industrial base. When you look at the industrial base of India and the industrial base of China, India's industrial base is not even 1/3 of China's industrial base. And this is a major weakness. And you cannot have a good industrial base if you don't have a good infrastructure. So everything is linked. But I guess maybe you will get back to that. I will take 2 more table reports. Here, Michael.
Thank you. Our table have participants from India, Singapore, Switzerland, Malaysia. The issues that we think are crucial and important are firstly the East Asian security issue, the potential flashpoints between China, Japan, Korea, and the wider geopolitical issues that may create stability that may impact on growth. We are also concerned about environmental challenge, the quality of air. In Southeast Asia, we have problems of haze, quality of water and environment. There's also concern about the lack of talent, the issue of human capital, education, and the need to upgrade skills among the workforce. We are also concerned about the need to have better infrastructure, better investment in education, and also the concern about how we can better promote entrepreneurship in many of our countries. With regard to India, there is a question as to how India can become better integrated with the Asian economy and how we can get more investments into India and to address some of the issues about getting funds out of India for investors to be more comfortable about investing in India. And final point is the widening income gap and growing inequalities. Thank you.
Thank you. One last table report. Let us go there.
Sir, we are from IMS Ghaziabad, PGDM students, and on this table we have discussed few points, and I think most of the points are covered, but still I want to stress on a few things. First, we have there's a shift in the economic balance in this world. Emerging markets are actually taking the GDP of the world higher, like India and Brazil and all these countries are actually helping to increase the GDP of the world. So I think India should be allowed to play a greater role at world level, and should we have a higher say in various world forums such as the UN and other forums. Other thing I want to highlight is that there is an increasing problem of natural calamity occurring worldwide, and this should be addressed through a natural calamity management. The third point, the education system. Well, sir, we have a good system. We have a scheme called Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan going on. We are all talking about that the education system should be made better. But there are two things that need to be focused here. First one is quality of education. Other is the nutritional food that we provide to our children. This nutrition food is actually can be provided by the government, who provide free food to the schools all over India, and it can be possible only if government is allowed to procure more food directly from farmers. But because of international law, government is not able to procure most of the food, and because of the upper limit that is put on India, that cannot procure up to this limit. That's why I think India should be allowed more on the World Forum to help its own population first. Therefore, need a higher say at world level.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Now, Rakesh, you would want to react to what we have heard. You can stay there or you can come here. So,
as usual, Claude has been very smart in that he did the easy part of giving the first prepared lecture, although it was very impressive that he didn't have a shred of notes here. He spoke totally, but obviously he must have been rehearsing for the last few days to be able to do that. And he's now given me this impossible task of commenting on this very wide collection of views and concerns. So I'll try and do my best to try and put some structure to this. First, I think that people are, it seems, implicitly agreed that the emerging markets, the developing countries, do have a good future. Some said it, some of course didn't. But there are all kinds of concerns in terms of being able to actually accomplish the kind of potential that emerging markets and developing countries have. Let me first start with some things that are not mentioned actually. I was surprised that there wasn't much mention of investment as a whole. Maybe it was implied in terms of ease of doing business, etc. But there is an issue to my mind that if the emerging markets and developing countries do achieve high growth, then we have to keep up high investments. But it was kind of reflected to a certain extent by a number of people talking about governance, ease of doing business, etc. But nonetheless, it does seem to me that there needs to be perhaps more thought on what is going to be the investment environment, particularly with real interest rates hardening over the next few years, and what that implies for businesses in our countries, moving or transitioning from relatively low real interest rates over the last number of years, which we've sort of got seduced into getting used to. The positive side of that, of course, is that with higher real interest rates, you will probably have to have harder thinking of good projects. So you have fewer bad projects, hopefully, because in an easy liquidity situation, low interest rates, you are much more seduced to bad projects as well. So I think that's a general issue to my mind that was not enough talked about, is what is going to be different about the investment environment apart from the regulatory issues, etc. There's sort of on the investment side, on the human capital side, it's quite striking to me that the most common thought expressed was to do with education and technical training. I think it's because of Mr. Ramadurai, who started the ball rolling, because he's in charge of skilling in India. He's just skilling 1.2 billion people. So maybe it's because he's co-chairman of this conference, and also because he started the ball rolling. But it is quite striking to me. I think that in the many business conferences that I've been in, I've been absent for the last few years, but I don't think I've heard this particular concern as widely expressed as it has been here. And what is interesting about that is that in the United States also, there's a great deal of discussion, and in advanced countries as a whole, and there are kind of two aspects to it. One is, and this was mentioned by some people, that with the change in technology and advance in technology, is there a gap in some sense between what is required in terms of skills and what is being supplied in terms of skills? And that many activities which earlier did not require much skills have either disappeared in the sense that they have been automated, or that those activities have become more skill intensive. So it has become more difficult for the vast mass of unskilled to get into that. And I think that there have been a number of studies in the past 3-4 years which have actually done this documentation quite well. And among the countries that we will have difficulty in this is our own country, that is India. And that is what Mr. Ramadurai is in charge of. And I hope you'll continue doing this even with the possible change in government. I have to be careful what I say on that. So I said possible change in government. So the issue really is twofold. As I said, one, that in more advanced countries where you do have high basic literacy, lots of people who've been to college, certainly high school and so on, but not having adequate technical expertise in the kind of jobs that are coming up. What is interesting to me, for example, in that evaluation that I saw some time back, was that even in the United States, the number of people getting college degrees, the growth in the number of people getting college degrees, even abstracting from what they're getting those college degrees in, the growth in the number of college degrees has actually been lagging the demand for highly educated people, which I was surprised to see. And that is kind of consistent with the inequality increasing also, so that people who do get technically trained do get higher salaries, higher compensation. So one side is that is even in countries that have high literacy, everyone getting educated, etc., there's a mismatch between the skills that have been produced and the skills that are required. Then on the other side, that is countries like ours, maybe Indonesia and some other countries, that where in fact, even though most of the countries have now ramped up, someone mentioned Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, that is education for all, that at the primary school level, you're now getting almost 100% enrollment rates. But a lot of the evaluations that you get is that the quantity has increased, but there's a huge problem in quality. And those countries like ours, which do not have this demographic problem, that is India, Indonesia, among other countries, some other countries, are among the countries where we don't have the problem of fast aging yet. We'll also get to it in 20 years from now. But where the proportion of people in the working age group that are 15 to 60 or thereabouts is going to be increasing. But the problem is that you already have a stock of people today in the 15 to 60 age group, or say the 15 to 30 age group, who will be in the labor force in the next 20, 30 years, who already have not had schooling. And so this issue of vocational education, what is not also mentioned enough was adult education. There is all this group, that is people, say today the age of, above the age of 15, who are either illiterate or have only been to class 2, class 3, class 4, only primary education, etc., will essentially be unemployable unless there are huge programs for adult education. First, just pure literacy. Then what Mr. Ramadurai does, that is technical vocational education. So it seems to me that this is one general problem that surprisingly has come up almost from almost all the tables. I would add to that, which I was also referring to earlier, is that in some of our countries, certainly in India, we have the image of being highly technically proficient. But if you look at the number of PhDs produced in India in technical subjects is minuscule. Whether you take engineering, you take anything actually, or you take economics for that matter, that there are very few PhDs produced. And when you say PhD produced, people say, why does it matter? PhDs don't do anything, But the relevance of that is that for training, higher level training, you need people to teach. At higher levels of teaching, that is university teaching, etc., you need PhDs. And so in fact, I know that there's a large number of new universities coming up in India. They have difficulty hiring. If I remember correctly, I think even the Indian Institute of Technology, IITs, have something like a 25 to 30% vacancy rate for hiring of professors. The short point is that this problem of this problem of education and skilling exists at all levels in our countries. That is the pure literacy issue, the vocational education issue, but also the higher technical issue. And this is also connected to some of the other issues that everyone mentioned, which is governance, implementation, etc., which again I referred to in my initial remarks, which is that that apart from the pure issue of corruption, which is to do with pure greed and criminal activity, etc., is also the issue that there are many problems arise in governance, and especially as you have more complex activities. That is, if you do public-private partnerships, whether it is in roads, whether it's in airports, whether it is in ports, education, health, etc., that a much greater level of competence is required to be able to do those contracts and that governance of public-private partnerships so that you don't have corruption. Because the fact of the matter is that wherever there's government discretion involved, government award of contracts where then you become the sole supplier, that you need a much greater level of competence and regulation and technical regulation. As I said, I'm abstracting from the sort of pure greed corruption issue. It is also that when there's lack of competence and lack of clarity in the regulation, lack of technical competence in enforcing contracts, etc., in designing contracts, etc., it gives rise very obviously to much higher incentives for corruption, both from supply and demand, that is to say that from the private sector trying to get those contracts, and from the government side giving those contracts, where there's lack of clarity. And so this issue of governance also, to my mind, apart from enforcement of laws, etc., is also to do with with competence, and there has not been enough attention paid by governments of how to ramp up quality in governance. I was more familiar about 15 years back, where I know in Malaysia, for example, there was a total quality management approach to governance, to government activity. And there was a lot of certification, ISO 9000, whatever, which was being done in government departments, and that every level of the government had to do that. I have heard much less about that. I don't know if it's still going on, but I've heard much less about that. And so the point I'm making is that we had this huge movement in manufacturing, starting in Japan in the total quality management movement, and a great deal of change took place in manufacturing management. A lot of that can take place in the operation of governmental activity. It does seem to me that there is an opportunity here also for the private sector in terms of supplying the way that quality management can be done in government and regulatory agencies, etc. Which also brings me to regulation per se, that as we move to, in this country and emerging markets in general, actually emerging markets much more than advanced economies, the PPP model is much more there to be seen in the provision of infrastructure and other government services in emerging markets than advanced economies, that you therefore have had the need now to set up regulatory authorities, whether it is in telecom, whether it is in civil aviation, power, and so you name an activity as a regulatory authority. Now, those are necessary as long as there is this issue of public-private partnerships, because someone has to regulate those activities. And so here again, there's a big issue of training people to be in the regulatory authorities. And one of the interesting things to me, I probably have a record of being a member of the most regulatory authorities in my career. So I've been a member of the Securities Exchange Board of India, I've been in the Reserve Bank of India, I've been a member of the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, I've been a member of the Tariff Authority of Major Ports, and a couple of others. And what I've learned from this is that two things. One, that you really need a high level of competence, which I did not have to be, clearly I couldn't be competent to be in each of these authorities. Presumably I do not know enough about telecom, I do not know enough about ports, central banking, securities, and so on. But it's a shortage of technical competence that I was on these. What I learned in this was also that things also keep changing. So, for example, since the most recent thing I've done was in central banking, that in the United Kingdom, there was a huge change that took place in the mid-1990s when the Bank of England was made independent and financial regulation was taken away from the Bank of England. They set up a financial services authority. As a consequence of the North Atlantic financial crisis, they've now moved back. So that financial regulation has come back to the Bank of England, and they've had to change a lot of their thinking to do with financial regulation. So my point is that even with the most established areas of regulation, which is in monetary policy and banking and financial regulation, things keep changing. And you need competence to keep up with those changes. So it is very interesting the Bank of England hired a Canadian to be the new governor, and they've just hired a new deputy governor who's actually, she is Egyptian, American, and British. But they actually imported someone from outside to do that. So to come back, so the issue of regulation is very important. And a lot of people talked about not having adequate clarity of government policy, etc., which then inhibits investment. I have a slightly different view on that, which is that I think we as regulators have been irresponsible in trying to tell the private sector, look, you're going to have more clarity. Obviously, we should strive for more clarity, but it does seem to me that we do need to understand the world keeps changing, so that uncertainty is part of doing business, and that we should be less sure from the regulatory side of giving clarity. Again, don't misunderstand. I'm not saying that we should not strive for clarity. All I'm saying is we need to have a better sense of reality, that there is going to be uncertainty in the private sector side. You need to do better risk management to cope with the uncertainty that we provide from the regulatory side. Part of the uncertainty we provide may be because of lack of competence. Part of it may be because governments change, policies change. But part of it is because the world changes. How much more time do I have to? Oh, good. So I've almost finished, is it, in time? Oh, terrific. But I've only covered 2 points, actually. So let me just then, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have gone along with some of these things, but some of the more important points also to do with, I'll take 5 minutes? 2, okay. Infrastructure, I should have mentioned much earlier, but I've mentioned it partially to do with regulation. A general issue with infrastructure that is going to arise is the issue, again, the issue of availability of finance, which is going to be more difficult in the years to come. And the infrastructure requirements in our countries, apart perhaps from China, which has already invested perhaps a great deal in infrastructure, are very, very large. As I said, I just recently finished a report on transport in India, and the infrastructure, the investment requirements for transport itself are very high indeed for the next 20 years. So this is an area that requires even greater innovation that has taken place in the last 20 years in terms of getting the adequate long-term finance for infrastructure. I'll conclude by also mentioning two other things, which is I was glad that only towards the end someone mentioned manufacturing. And I've been puzzled in India particularly. You mentioned Claude right now, that very puzzling is that when we started the economic reform process in 1991, our whole focus was, the first policy came was industrial policy, the deregulation of industrial policy. And the thing that gets very little attention now is manufacturing growth, which in India has come down to just about zero over the last 2 years. And this is very important that looking at, you mentioned China, that looking at the rising wages in China, which will keep rising, there is going to be a massive shift of low-wage manufacturing out of China, that other countries in Asia, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, Myanmar, India, Bangladesh, etc., need to prepare themselves for this huge shift in manufacturing. And in terms of demand for manufactured goods, if one thinks of the 2.5 to 3 billion people between China, India, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, etc., just think of each of us buying one shirt more a year or one pair of shoes a year more relative to the last 10 years. So there's going to be continuing huge demand for all these goods, regardless of what the Americans, if they stop buying shirts or the Europeans stop buying shirts, there's going to be a huge demand for these products which are made in labor-using industries. And so I'm very puzzled on how come there's not more attention of how we can have more labor-using industry, which comes to the issue of employment. And that, the final point, which is to do with trade, that yes, I think a number of people mentioned it, that there are continuing issues with the South-South trade. We have to lower our barriers because of what I just mentioned, that the demand from our countries, forget Europe and the US, the demand from our countries for manufactured goods, I mentioned the low-tech manufactured goods, you take the whole of activity, infrastructure activity and so on is going to be going up a lot. There's going to be more and more demand for manufactured goods, and which also requires a lot of trade facilitation, which includes the issues, technical issues to do with standards, harmonization of standards across countries, and also mutual recognition agreements for trade and services and so on. So those are also very issues that are of importance.
Thank you.
I thought I wouldn't have enough to say. I wouldn't be able to survive more than 5 minutes, but I think I managed all right.
Rakesh mentioned that I was a smart man, maybe, but not for the reason he gave. Because as a smart man, I know my limitations. I knew that I could deal with the prepared remarks. I could not improvise as he did. This is why he got the difficult part. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rakesh. And please stay seated. We are moving now directly to the discussion, which is at the very heart of the theme of this second annual meeting, which is reviving growth. And we have quite an outstanding panel of 4 speakers who will be now coming to the stage right now with my colleague Tarun Das. So please stay seated as we move ahead. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Overseas Chinese office, and so there's quite a few. Yeah. For tourist dollars, even, yeah. Absolutely. No, the tourism is declining. You know, the foreigners visiting Beijing was dropped.